Hello and welcome. My name's Mark Neild. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Innovation and Entrepreneurship here at the University of Bristol. But I haven't always been an academic. In times past, I've also been a Senior Management Consultant negotiating what was at the time the largest outsourcing deal in Europe at about £2 million and several others besides. And I've always had a passionate interest on getting the best out of this, and in particular on how we can bring more innovation into the way we procure. Now, most of you will be here because you're thinking that there must be a better way of commissioning social services. Yet habits and conventional wisdom keep dragging us back to a place that seems no longer to deliver the outcomes we want. So how do we move forward? In this 22-minute video, I will show why a transactional approach works reasonably for buying physical things but poorly for services affecting people. We need to recognise the constraints of science and embrace a socio-cultural perspective that better explains human behaviour. That way lies better outcomes, better value for money, and greater well-being for staff and the beneficiaries of the services we commission. So come with me on this journey through philosophy and cultural psychology to explain the 5 things we need to do differently. To really understand what happens when we procure products and services, we need to go right back to the elemental blocks of how we know things to be true. There are several perspectives from which to view and analyse the way we work. Firstly, inside to outside, our own thoughts and experiences, and at the individual to collective level. So let's just spend a few minutes examining what this means in practice. I is the world of the subjective, our own individual perspective on the world viewed from within. It's a safe viewpoint, but subject to massive bias that we're typically completely unaware of. It is the world of the objective, individual items outside of us that we can measure, observe, and independently verify. It's a great perspective for physical entities that exist independently of their environment, but leave us dangerously blinded about the inner world of beings that adapt and change with their situation. We like the scientific. There are rules and predictability. The same properties that dropped the apple on Newton's head allow us to shoot rockets deep into space with very high confidence of them landing where we planned. Absolutely fabulous for quantitative analysis. But as Brené Brown, a researcher studying courage and empathy, observes, it leaves us to frightening gaps in the qualitative. We is the intersubjective, a collective experience inside our heads of shared meaning, culture, and experience. This is the world of empathy, leadership, well-being, and resilience, the stuff that makes such a difference to the lives of real people. Yet we struggle to provide for it in our current ways of working. Which is why entities are so much easier to procure. You know what you're going to get, you can specify it in detail and agree that it has been delivered. And social change is a lot harder to get outcomes because it relies on relations and interactions that much of procurement practice disallows. So in our search for the simplicity of science, we attach labels, we stereotype, we label, we introduce otherness, looking for differences where there are none, leading us to make assumptions based on misunderstanding. Darren's book, Poverty Safari, is a frightening expose of the many failures of policy and procurement, perpetrated primarily by people who thought they were doing the right thing. So how do we fix this? It's not that we don't want to, it's just that our brains don't work that way. Michael Cole's excellent book explains the birth of cultural psychology, which explains human behaviour so much better than scientific observation. And he builds on the groundbreaking work of Russian developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who was working about a century ago. So let's delve into culture. So what is culture? Let's spend a few minutes just exploring what the nature of culture is and how it affects the way we behave. For me, the easiest way of understanding culture is through this mathematical symbol. Culture is the sum of all of our experiences and influences that have affected the way we live from 0 to now. So when zero? Well, we could say zero was when we were born, or perhaps when we started our current job, or from as far back as we can remember. But in fact, things that have influenced us go back many years before that. Think of things like the Industrial Revolution. Think of works of art, famous music, plays, those sorts of things. Think of family traditions. There are many, many things that pre-exist the point where we were conscious that influence the way we live. The French philosopher Pierre Bourdieu, in his book Outline of a Theory of Practice, described this thing called habitus, which is deeply ingrained habits, skills and dispositions. And this, I think, is a very good way of describing what it is. And the fact that it's deeply ingrained and that its habits and skills and dispositions we'll unpack in a minute. So let's just have a little think about what the properties of culture might be. Well, the first one that we've described already is the fact that it's intangible. We're very aware that it's there, lots of people are writing about it, but in terms of measuring it, that's almost impossible. This next one, obvious, is a curious one. Often when you do things, people may ask you why you're doing it, and sometimes you'll find yourself at a loss for words. Well, it's obvious, you think. And now when you're saying things like that, and when you're thinking that it's obvious, that's a clear sign that it's actually in the habit part of your brain. You've been doing it this way for so long that you've never stopped to question why. But there's a big challenge, and the whole reason why obvious is in double inverted commas here is because maybe it is obvious to you, but it's far from obvious to anyone else because they simply haven't had the whole depth of the experience and influences that has brought you to the place where what you're doing is obvious. And so this can be a real challenge to communication because it's very difficult both to explain why you're doing it because it's obvious, but also to understand why people can't see why you're doing it. And this brings us on to the subconscious. So much of culture is in the subconscious. So it's something that we don't really understand what we're doing. It's part of the habit part of our brain, which accounts for about 80% of our mental activity. And if you think about driving, that's mostly done out of the subconscious. Loads of various activities that you just do on autopilot, and you don't really understand why you're doing it. So in a way, this is related to obvious, but the fact that it's in the subconscious also means that it's deeply ingrained, as Bourdieu explained. And the thing about the subconscious and culture is it does shape our perceptions and values. We may not know why we like or dislike things, and they may not be rational at all, but for some reason in our past or in the past of people who've influenced us, there has been some reason why people have the perceptions that they do and the values that they do. And this can be very tricky because we don't really understand why. And that brings us to this concept of otherness. So there'll be values and perceptions of the people who are around us in our community that we're familiar with, and these are shared values and perceptions. And there'll be people with other perceptions and values. And this concept of otherness it gives us some suspicion. It makes us actually quite nervous. And maybe this is some primordial reflex to try and keep us safe, that where we see things that we don't understand, we're naturally suspicious of them. And that can lead to all sorts of biases. It can lead to things like racism and homophobia and all sorts of other things which are not necessarily rational and actually stop us from having a really open mind to experience and enjoy the perspectives of others. And this is often why we get ourselves into trouble. It's not because we deliberately go doing offensive behaviour. It's simply that it's hardwired into our brain. If we move on to the last one of these, this concept of shorthand, and in a way this is the most interesting. Indeed, it's this very shorthand that has enabled human civilization as we know it, according to Vygotsky's general genetic theory of development. So let's just explain what it is. If I was to say the word book, you'd have a very clear idea, probably quite a complex mental model in your head of exactly what we're talking about. You'd envisage pages, several pages, probably some writing, maybe some drawings, maybe some illustrations, maybe some photographs, all bound together in some kind of cover with some illustration on the back and the front. So that's a really quite rich description of something that was expressed in 4 symbols. And this is one of the strange things about culture, is that it allows us to communicate with things without having to explain in vast detail what we're talking about. But of course, our shorthand, again, in the same way as obvious, might be different from somebody else's. And in the way we live and other things, we make assumptions that our shorthand is the same as others, and that can sometimes get us into an awful lot of difficulty. Now, we've talked a little bit about culture in the singular, thinking about what affects our individuals' perspectives, but of course culture is also a very social activity. Now, communities of practice is a term popularised by social anthropologists Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger in the latter part of the 20th century. It develops what we've just been discussing about culture beyond the individual habitus and into group practice, as further described also by Pierre Bourdieu. Now, we can examine the culture of organisations on 6 levels using a model by NLP practitioner Robert Dilts. So if we imagine this to be our workplace, at the base of the pyramid is this thing called the environment. So this is the work environment. This is the physical space in which we work. And of course, just thinking of the pandemic for a minute, what we might have experienced as a nice place to work if we're working from home, if we have a nice house, we've got a separate office, or maybe we've got a spare bedroom where we could go and do work, could be incredibly different from that of our service users who might be sharing a high-rise flat with 5 people in a single 1-bedroom flat. And imagine how difficult their environment is to work when they're stuck working remotely. Moving up the pyramid, we get to behaviours. And again, often within our communities, our behaviours are shared. We tend to recruit people who conform to the behaviours that we put on the job description, and our disciplinary code and various other things like that tends to sanction certain behaviours and encourage others. So not unsurprisingly, within our communities of practice, we have a fairly common set of behaviours. And when we see different behaviours in others, we can either not understand it or possibly even condemn it. Moving up the pyramid one further, we come to this concept of capabilities. And likewise, to allow people into our communities, we normally require some minimum standard, education, qualifications, things like that. And we can't always understand that other people don't have those as well. So these are quite important in terms of moving on or moving up or getting in the first place. Further up, we have this beliefs and value system, what we believe to be important, if you like, the ethics of the organisation. So this is a bit more than behaviours, it's more the sort of things that we value and hold to be true and hold to be right. And behaviours, to a certain extent, is just the way they're expressed, but the beliefs and values are the cause of why we write the ethical codes. Further up, we have this sense of identity. Who do we belong to? And we will quite often have some kind of corporate or organisational or departmental identity, which in a corporate environment might be related to brand, but often in a public service organisation is something to do with what it is, our job function or something like that. And it is in many ways the thing that ties us all together because we all share this identity. And then moving right to the top, we have this concept of mission, which is what we're all about. Why are we here? What brings us together? What's important for us? What, if you like, is the North Star that guides our activities? So if we look at our own culture in this particular way, it's quite easy to imagine that there will be a similar but very different set of cultures that apply either to our suppliers or to our users. And so therefore they have a very different community of practice. And we might understand then why we don't understand why they have certain capabilities that are different from ours, why they have different missions, different beliefs and values. And this can make things very difficult for us to see inside them, because for all the reasons that we talked about previously in terms of our own limitations of understanding others and the things that we describe as obvious, these are obvious within our community, and the shorthand that we adopt within our community can be very, very similar. But outside of our community, they have their own version of this, and quite often it's quite difficult to communicate. So how do we arrive at some kind of shared meaning? How do we arrive at a point when we say something, we both know that we're talking about the same thing? We're not violently disagreeing about the same words because we see them in such a different way. Well, the answer, of course, comes down to the interactions that we have between the various communities of practice. So this is now some of my own research, looking at how stakeholders interact to improve innovation. Starting at the base, interactions are negatives, with each party trying to maximise their own position with no regard for the other. You'll recognise this as competition because it's in many ways the default position of the way we do things at the moment. Moving up is coexistence. Now this is neutral, there are no interactions, so it's not really very interesting to look at in any detail. So moving on to cooperation. This can be regarded as competition tamed, where we agree rules in a contract or other device to govern fair play. So this stops us from each trying to take more from the other because there's a boundary defined between us that we're quite happy to work with. Quite often this is as far as we get in procurement. Moving on up, we end up with collaboration, and this is different in that we flex those rules and are a lot more flexible with them to adapt to the relative strengths and capabilities where mutually advantageous. But the scope of the agreement never really varies, and the power between the supplier and the customer often doesn't vary at all. Quite often when we talk about consulting as the procurer or the commissioner, what we really mean is we will ask questions that we want the answers to, but very rarely will we ask people to define their own questions and tell us what they think unsolicited, and in this way we keep hold of the power. And this is one of the big distinctions between this and co-creation. So co-creation is a different beast. There's no scope to start with and no defined roles, but just a will to deliver an agreed vision. It's not utopia because it recognises practical limitations, but sees them as challenges to overcome rather than immutable barriers. The lack of roles flattens hierarchy and diminishes the value of expertise, which some people find threatening and uncomfortable. But these sorts of interactions lead to amazing outcomes and frequently to awards. But how do we engender such interactions? There are 5 conditions necessary to move from a profit-driven view to a purpose-driven world, and that's what we're going to look at next. So moving from left to right, the first of these is ontology. Now ontology is the philosophical description from which we opened with. At the bottom of the pyramid is the scientific and external view of objective measurement. At the top is we, the intersubjective view. To climb, we need to recognise the limitations of science and accounting. Next along is power. We need to recognise the contribution users and suppliers can make and not be afraid of ceding them responsibility to deliver things that they may be aware of, but we're not. To the right of the pyramid comes our view of resources and scope. At the bottom we see scarcity, a single pie that we're fighting for the biggest slice of. At the top we imagine almost unlimited opportunity. Let's make a pie factory so we're all better off. Of course there are limits, but instead of focusing on costs to deliver a fixed scope, we imagine the possibilities that can be delivered within the budget. Next comes a relationship. If we're thinking we value a relationship based on shared values over transactional value. And finally comes motivation. At the bottom, it's all about carrot and stick. At the top, we're thinking about doing something amazing and our contribution to making the world a better place. And what's interesting about intrinsic motivation is that researchers most recently have discovered that it's a far power motivator than extrinsic, and that even if people are motivated by their values and their beliefs, and we start giving them money for it, it can actually reduce their motivation, which is kind of a curious and counterfactual fact. So let's just unpack that last one a bit more by looking at social ventures. Now, certainly up until the beginning of the Great Crash of about a decade ago, the overarching consensus was that we were all about maximising shareholder value. So if we look at this diagram, how do we maximise shareholder value? Well, if we look at suppliers, we're very, very interested in minimising the purchase costs. We want to transfer as much value into our shareholders as we possibly can, and this is an element of competition. If we think about employees, we're wanting to minimise the wage bill, get as much out of them for as little as we can get away with, and again trying to maximise the value to our shareholders. And thinking about our customers or our end users or our service users, What we really want to do is to minimize the value provided so that we can actually make sure that we tick the boxes in terms of getting paid for stuff, but not in such a way that we're giving away any more than we absolutely need to. And you probably recognize some of these behaviors with some of the people that you've been working with. If we move into a view of maximizing stakeholder purpose, we get a different perspective. Is suppliers, we're looking at an ethical supply chain. We're looking at ways of innovation whereby we can reduce collectively the costs rather than squeezing all the margin we can out of them. With our employees, we're thinking living wage, we're thinking development, we're thinking how can we actually get you contributing more? How can we develop you? How can we turn you into a more contributing person? Not because we want to squeeze more out of you, because we recognize that you'll achieve an awful lot more and be a lot happier, have much greater well-being if you're doing that. And when we think about our beneficiaries, be they our customers or our service users, we're trying to think about how we can get the best deal for them. How can we deliver as much as we possibly can without having an unlimited budget? And this is the fundamental difference between social purpose and shareholder value. So stakeholder versus shareholder, as some people look at it. But if we move on and think about the implications for innovation, they can be quite stark too. Because when we're in the place of maximizing shareholder value, we're often innovating to our people in order to improve the portion of value that we can get for them. And often you find these innovations that people don't buy into because they're actually working against what they really want. But when we're in the maximizing stakeholder purpose, then we tend to do innovation with people or do it for them at the very least. Which means that we'll roll up our sleeves and say, how can we get something that is mutually beneficial? How do we get a relationship going? And how do we create things which overcome the various barriers that we're recognizing? And it sounds like a great thing, and it is a great thing. But this is the real power of managing for stakeholder purpose, purpose-driven companies, rather than simply thinking about competition and financial value. Now, I recognise that what I've just been talking about often flies in the face of conventional wisdom, so I just wanted to finish with a couple of quotes that you can read to understand that this isn't in the land of fantasy. This is real, this is effective, this stuff works.